That cold morning, no one expected an act of compassion to change everything. What started as another quiet day near the reserve became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, every roar and every breath matters, because behind every white tiger there is a story worth saving. The frost clung to the pines like a fragile promise, the kind that breaks under the weight of winter's indifference. Elias Thorne had been up before dawn, as always, his breath fogging the air as he trudged the perimeter fence of the Willow Creek Wildlife Reserve. At 42, he was the head ranger, a man whose life had become a rhythm of patrols and paperwork, the wild just beyond his reach. The reserve sprawled across the edge of Montana's backcountry, a patchwork of snow-dusted meadows and shadowed forests where the line between sanctuary and survival blurred. Elias paused at the eastern gate, his gloved hand tightening on the thermos of black coffee. The wind carried a faint, ragged sound, not the howl of wolves or the crack of branches, but something deeper, a labored exhale that hummed through the frozen ground. He froze, ears straining. It came again, a low, stuttering rumble, like thunder trapped in a chest. His flashlight cut through the dim light, sweeping the underbrush beyond the fence. There, half hidden in a thicket of brambles, lay the tigress. She was a white tiger, her fur a ghostly shimmer against the snow, marred by streaks of mud and exhaustion. Her sides heaved with each breath, eyes half-lidded in a glaze of pain. Around her, two tiny forms huddled, cubs no more than weeks old, their white coats matted and trembling. She had dragged them here, perhaps sensing the fence as a boundary between peril and faint hope. Labor had come too soon, too harshly. One cub mewled weakly, the other still and silent. Elias's heart slammed against his ribs. White tigers weren't native here. This one must have escaped from some illicit breeder up north, or worse, a poacher's trap gone wrong. Rumors had swirled for months, sightings of a pale ghost in the hills, whispers of a big cat terrorizing livestock, but seeing her now, collapsed and vulnerable, stripped away the myth. She wasn't a monster. She was a mother, fighting for breath in a world that had no place for her. He backed away slowly, radio crackling to life at his hip. "Base, this is Thorne. Got a situation at the east fence. Big cat down. White tiger, female, with cubs. She's in bad shape." Static, then the voice of dispatch, young and edged with nerves. "Jesus, Elias, you sure?" "I'll call the sheriff and Doc Harlan. Stay clear. Could be rabid or something." "Stay clear." The words hung in the air like smoke. Elias knelt at a distance, watching her chest rise and fall. Her eyes flickered open, golden slits locking onto him, not with rage, but a weary plea, the raw instinct of survival reaching across the divide. The cub stirred, one nuzzling her flank, its tiny paws kneading futilely. By the time the first truck rumbled up the gravel road, the sun had crested the ridge, painting the scene in pale gold. Sheriff Lena Voss stepped out, her boots crunching ice, hand resting on her holster. She was a decade younger than Elias, all sharp angles and no-nonsense gaze, elected on a platform of protecting the town from outside threats. Behind her, a veterinarian Marcus Hale unloaded a tranquilizer kit from his SUV, his face drawn. Hale was the reserve's on-call doc, a man who'd patched up deer and bears, but never something like this. "What the hell is it doing here?" Voss muttered, peering through binoculars. "Folks are already spooked. Lost a calf last week. Bet that's her work." Elias shook his head, voice low. "She's not hunting. Look at her. She's dying. Gave birth out here from the looks. Cubs are hypothermic." Hale approached cautiously, syringe in hand. "If we trank her, we might kill her. She's too weak, and those cubs, we'll have to separate them." The tigress's breath hitched, a soft growl escaping as the wind shifted, carrying their scents to her. She lifted her head slightly, muscles rippling under her fur, but there was no charge, no lunge, just that stare, ancient and unyielding, as if weighing their souls. Voss crossed her arms. Town council's gonna want her put down. Dangerous animal, escaped exotic. We can't risk it wandering into backyards. Elias felt a familiar ache twist in his gut, the same one that had kept him up nights since his wife left, taking their dreams of a family with her. He'd chosen this life for the wild, but moments like this made him question it. She's not a threat right now. She's asking for help in her way. Hale hesitated, glancing between them. Legally, Voss is right, but ethically. If we walk away, it's on us. The silence stretched, broken only by the Tigress's shallow rasps and the distant hum of engines cooling on the highway. Elias's hands trembled as he set down his thermos. The cold seeped through his jacket, but it was her eyes that chilled him. Not fear, but resignation. How many times had he turned away from the hard calls, patrolled the fences, reported the intrusions, but never crossed the line? He took a step forward, ignoring Voss's sharp intake of breath. "Easy, girl," he whispered, voice barely carrying. The Tigress didn't flinch. Slowly, he unclipped a blanket from his pack, the wool rough against his fingers. He tossed it toward her, letting it land soft and open near the cubs. One stirred, its nose twitching at the warmth. Voss radioed for backup, her words clipped. "We need a containment team. Now!" But Elias stayed, kneeling just beyond reach. The cubs' mules grew fainter, the mother's breaths sinking with the wind's sigh. In that frozen moment, the reserve felt smaller, the world narrowing to the space between man and beast. Hale joined him, voice hushed. "If we move her, it has to be now. Field surgery's our only shot. Get the cubs stable. Treat her for shock." Elias nodded, his mind racing. The fence loomed like a judgment, but compassion burned hotter. He reached for the bolt cutters on his belt, the metal cold and unyielding. One snip, and the barrier broke, not with violence, but necessity. As the first strands of wire parted, the Tigress's eyes met his again. Trust, fragile as new snow. The truck doors slammed in the distance, voices rising, but Elias focused on her labored rise and fall. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a mirror, reflecting the man he could still be. The wind picked up, dusting their tracks with fresh white. And in the quiet that followed, the story truly began. The wire snapped with a sharp twang, echoing like a confession in the crisp air. Elias worked methodically, his breath steady despite the knot in his chest, parting the fence just enough for access. The Tigress watched, her golden eyes unblinking, flanks rising and falling in shallow rhythm. No snarl, no retreat, just that quiet vigilance, as if she understood the breach was for her. The cubs, tiny ghosts in the snow, huddled closer to her warmth, their mules faint threads in the wind. Sheriff Voss's voice cut through the hush, edged with urgency. "Thorn, what the hell are you doing? That's tampering with reserve property. Back off, containment teams en route." Elias didn't turn, his cutters pausing mid-snip. "She's not property, Voss, and if we wait, there won't be anything left to contain." He glanced at Hale, who nodded grimly, already prepping a makeshift sling from tarps in his truck. The vet's hands, usually steady with scalpels and sutures, fumbled the straps, betraying the tremor of doubt. The reserve's edge stretched out like a forgotten map. Chain-link fences scarred by rust and wildlife scratches, flanked by skeletal aspens that whispered secrets to the sky. Beyond lay Willow Creek, a scatter of ranch houses and timber mills, where folks scraped by on logging and cattle, their lives hemmed by the wild's indifference. Elias knew this land's pulse, the way fog rolled off the creek at dawn, the distant low of herds echoing off canyon walls. But today, it felt altered, the air thick with the scent of pine resin and something primal, like wet earth after rain. Hale knelt beside Elias, voice low. Pulse is thready. She's in hypervolemic shock, lost blood from the birth, exposure on top. The cubs are worse. One's barely breathing. He extended a gloved hand toward the smaller cub, but it recoiled with a pitiful hiss, burrowing into its mother's fur. The tigress's head lifted fractionally, a low rumble vibrating her throat, not threat but warning. Protection etched in every taut muscle. Voss paced the perimeter, radio pressed to her ear. ETA 5 minutes. Doc, you got a plan, or are we just playing hero? Her stance was all business, boots grinding gravel, but Elias caught the flicker in her eyes. The same one he'd seen in her during town hall debates, when budgets pitted conservation against jobs. Voss had grown up here, lost her brother to a logging accident years back. The wild was enemy territory to her, a thief of stability. From the highway, headlights pierced the thinning mist, tires crunching to a halt. 2 more vehicles pulled up, a reserve utility truck with junior rangers spilling out, and an old pickup belonging to Mira Lang, the wildlife photographer who'd been circling the area for weeks. She was in her 50s, silver-streaked hair tied back, camera slung around her neck like a talisman. Mira had arrived in Willow Creek chasing rumors of the white tiger, her shots destined for magazines that romanticized the untamed. But now, face to face, she lowered the lens, her expression softening into something raw. God, she breathed, edging closer. She's magnificent. But look at her. It's not just exhaustion. Parasites, maybe, from whatever hell she escaped. Mira's voice carried the lilt of someone who'd seen too many culls, her moral compass tilted toward the lens. Document, don't disturb. Yet she hesitated, fingers twitching as if to reach out. The junior rangers, kids fresh from training, wide-eyed and whispering, formed a loose circle, their breaths clouding in unison. One, a lanky boy named Jax, muttered to his partner, "Should have called animal control first. Thing like that could rip your arm off." Fear laced his words, the kind born from stories around campfires, where white tigers became phantoms of vengeance. The other nodded, gripping a catchpole like a lifeline, eyes darting to the underbrush as if expecting ambush. Elias ignored them, focusing on the tigress. He eased through the gap, blanket in hand, moving slow as dawn light. The ground was a mosaic of frost and mud, her body heat melting patches around her. Up close, the details pierced him. The faint scars on her muzzle, relics of captivity, the cub's ribs visible under translucent fur, their eyes sealed shut against the cold. She didn't growl as he approached, only exhaled, a warm puff that carried the musk of milk and desperation. "Easy now," Elias murmured, draping the blanket over the cubs first. The fabric settled soft, trapping what little warmth they had. One cub stirred, its paw batting weakly at the wool, while the mother's gaze followed every motion, pupils dilating in the shifting light. Trust was a fragile bridge, built on silence, and Elias crossed it inch by inch. Hale joined him, injecting a low-dose sedative into the tigress's haunch with a practiced flick. "Just enough to ease her. We can't move her without it." Her body slackened slightly, eyelids drooping, but her chest still labored, each breath a rasp against the quiet. Voss stepped forward, frustration etching lines on her face. "This is reckless. Town's on edge. Mrs. Hargrove's calling every hour about that calf. If this cat's responsible, we're liable." Her words hung, a judgment on the wild's intrusion, mirroring the council's stance. Protect the people, euthanize the problem. But beneath it, Elias sensed her conflict, the sheriff who enforced lines. Yet remembered the fawn her father once nursed back to health. Mira captured the moment in frames, Elias's shadowed profile, the tigress's pleading stare, the cub's huddled forms. "This isn't just a rescue," she said softly, almost to herself. "It's a reckoning. We've pushed them to the brink and now they're at our door." The containment team arrived then, their truck's engine growling to life. Floodlights bathing the scene in harsh white, nets unfurled, poles extended, voices barking coordinates. But as they closed in, the tigress's eyes snapped open, locking on Elias. A soft chuff escaped her, not pain, but recognition, instinct bridging the gap. The cub under the blanket mewled louder as if echoing her. Elias's hands steadied on her flank, feeling the faint thrum of her heart. The cold morning pressed in, dust motes swirling in the beams, engines cooling with metallic sighs. In that suspended breath, the reserve's world converged, fear clashing with mercy, silence judging the clamor. The tigress's struggle mirrored his own buried losses, the wife who'd left, the child they'd never had, the fences he'd built around his heart. As the team prepared the sling, Voss relented with a sigh, holstering her radio. "Fine, but if this goes south, it's on you, Thorn." Hale nodded, signaling the lift, while Mira's shutter clicked one last time, a frozen testament to the choice. The tigress rose unsteadily as they worked, her body a vessel of quiet strength, carrying her cubs toward uncertain salvation. The highway loomed empty in the distance, a ribbon of possibility winding through the frost. And in the hush that followed, Elias felt the weight shift, not just of fur and bone, but of the man emerging from the shadows. The sling tightened around the tigress's form with a soft creak of canvas and rope, her body lifting inch by inch from the frost-kissed earth. Elias held his breath, one hand steady on her flank, feeling the erratic flutter of her pulse beneath the striped fur. The containment team's movements were deliberate, shadows lengthening as the morning sun climbed higher, casting elongated silhouettes across the breached fence. No one spoke. The air hummed with the strain of ropes and the distant call of a crow, as if the forest itself held its judgment. Hale monitored her vitals with a portable unit, the screen's green glow flickering in his eyes. BP's dropping, 80 over 40. We need to stabilize her en route. IV fluids. Stat. His voice was a murmur, clipped by focus. As he threaded a catheter into her foreleg, the needle's glint lost in the white of her coat. The tigress's eyelids twitched, a low rumble vibrating through her chest. Not defiance, but the echo of pain she couldn't voice. One cub remained tucked against her, the blanket swaddling it like a fragile secret, while the other, the weaker one, lay separate in Hale's arms, its tiny chest rising in shallow, uneven hitches. Mira lingered at the edge, her camera now holstered, hands clasped as if in silent prayer. She'd seen rescues before, elephants in droughts, wolves snared in traps, but this felt different, intimate, like intruding on a birthright. The reserve's junior rangers hovered, Jax wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill. His earlier bravado dissolved into wide-eyed awe. She's not fighting," he whispered to no one, the words hanging like mist. Voss stood apart, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the highway where dust clouds signaled more arrivals, townfolk perhaps, drawn by radio chatter, their curiosity laced with suspicion. The truck bed lowered with a hydraulic whine, and they eased the Tigress aboard, her weight settling into the padded enclosure Hale had jury-rigged from hay bales and foam. Elias climbed in beside her, the metal cold against his knees, ignoring Voss's pointed stare. "I'm riding with her," he said, not a question. The engine roared to life, gravel spitting under tires as they pulled away from the fence line, the aspens blurring into a white-veined streak. The reserve receded, giving way to the winding road that snaked toward Willow Creek's outskirts, a ribbon of cracked asphalt flanked by barbed wire and skeletal fences, where ranch dogs barked from porches and the air smelled of wood smoke and diesel. Inside the truck cab, Hale drove, his knuckles white on the wheel, while Elias monitored the Tigress from the open back. Her breaths came in wet rasps now, each one sinking with the vehicle's sway, her golden eyes half open, reflecting the passing pines like fractured sunlight. The cub in his lap stirred, its paw flexing against the blanket, a faint warmth seeping through the wool. Elias's mind wandered to the empty crib in his cabin, the one he'd built with his own hands years ago, before the miscarriages and the silence that followed his wife's departure. Saving her felt like mending that fracture, a quiet defiance against loss. The clinic loomed ahead, a squat brick building on the town's edge, its sign faded by winters past, Harlan Veterinary Services. But Hale bypassed it, veering toward the reserve's makeshift rehab barn, a converted stable on the outskirts, equipped for larger patients with reinforced stalls and surgical bays. "Too public in town," he explained over the rumble. "Folks would swarm, and Voss is right about the council. They'll push for euthanasia if word spreads." As they unloaded, the Tigress's body sagged, her head lolling against the hay. Elias lifted the cubs carefully, their weights feather-light in his palms, and carried them inside. The barn smelled of antiseptic and straw, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting stark shadows on the concrete floor. Hale's assistant, a quiet woman named Clara who'd driven in from the next county, prepped the table. Warming lamps hummed to life, their glow bathing the space in amber. "Hypothermia first," Hale directed, his hand steadying as he examined the mother. "Uterine infection, likely from a difficult birth. We'll need antibiotics, fluids, and pray she doesn't seize." The procedure began in hushed urgency. Elias held the tigress's head, his fingers brushing her muzzle, feeling the rough texture of whiskers against his skin. She didn't resist the IV drip, only exhaled a sigh that fogged the air, her eyes locking onto his with a depth that pierced the clinical hum. Clara worked on the cubs, wrapping them in heated towels, her breaths hitching as she massaged the smaller one's chest. "Come on, little one," she whispered, voice cracking. The room filled with the soft beeps of monitors, the drip of saline, the tigresses labored inhales, a symphony of fragility. Outside, tires crunched again. Voss arrived with Mira and a cluster of locals. Mrs. Hargrove, the rancher whose calf had vanished, her face etched with suspicion, and old Tom Riley, the mill foreman, muttering about exotics ruining the balance. They gathered at the barn door, peering through the slats, their voices a low murmur of debate. "That thing's a killer," Hargrove insisted, her shawl clutched tight against the wind. "Shoulda ended it clean back there." Riley nodded, his pipe unlit, eyes narrowed. "Towns paid for fences, not feeding strays." Voss held them at bay, her stance a barrier. But doubt flickered in her posture, the sheriff torn between duty and the memory of her father's compassion. Mira slipped inside, her presence a quiet anchor, snapping discreet photos of the team's efforts. "They're fighting for her," she said softly to Elias, her lens capturing the tigress's pleading gaze. But the world's not. Tension coiled as Hale incised a shallow wound on the tigress's abdomen, draining fluid with steady hands, the scent of iodine sharp in the air. Her body tensed, a growl building low in her throat, but Elias's touch on her ear, gentle, reassuring, eased it to a rumble. The smaller cub's monitor flatlined briefly, Clara's tears falling silent as she administered oxygen, its chest rising once more in a miracle of tiny breaths. Elias's own hands trembled, the weight of the moment pressing like the barn's rafters. One wrong move, and it all unraveled. Hours blurred, the sun arcing toward noon, dust motes dancing in the light shafts. The tigress stabilized, her flanks steadying, the cubs nestling against her under the lamps. But as Hale sutured the last stitch, a distant roar echoed, not from her, but the wind carrying rumors from town. The council was convening, Voss's radio crackling with demands. Compassion had bridged the gap, but the world outside judged silently, waiting to pull it apart. Elias stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow, the tigress's eyes meeting his in quiet acknowledgement. In that breath, redemption whispered, not in words, but in the slow rise of her chest, the cub's warmth blooming like hope against the cold. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and compassion can travel. The barn's fluorescent hum deepened into afternoon, shadows pooling in the corners like unspoken doubts. Elias leaned against the stall wall, his back aching from hours of vigil, watching the tigress under the warming lamps. Her white fur gleamed softly now, no longer dulled by frost, but her breaths still carried a faint wheeze, each one a fragile thread holding her to the world. The cubs nestled against her belly, their tiny forms rising and falling in sync, the smaller one's eyes cracking open for the first time, milky blue slits that caught the light like distant stars. Hale had stepped out for supplies, leaving Clara to monitor the IV drip, her movements quiet and reverent, as if tending a sacred flame. Outside, the crowd had thickened, a murmur of voices seeping through the wooden slats like smoke. Mrs. Hargrove's sharp tones cut above the rest, laced with the bitterness of lost livestock. "That ranger's gone soft. Bringing a predator into our backyard. Next, it'll be kids in danger." Tom Riley grunted agreement, his pipe tapping rhythmically against his palm, the scent of unlit tobacco mingling with the chill wind that rattled the barn door. Voss stood sentinel, her radio silent for now, but her posture rigid. Eyes flicking between the gathering and the horizon, where the council's van might appear any moment. Mira hovered nearby, her camera idle, fingers tracing the strap as she absorbed the tension, the divide between those who saw threat and those who glimpsed something deeper. Elias pushed the door open a crack, the cold air rushing in like a reprimand. The tigress stirred at the shift, her head lifting slightly, golden eyes finding him across the space. No growl, just that steady gaze, instinct weaving a silent bond. He crossed back to her, kneeling on the straw-strewn floor, his hand hovering near her muzzle. The warmth from her breath brushed his skin, carrying the faint milky scent of new life. "Hang in there," he whispered, the words more for himself than her. In the quiet, memories surfaced unbidden. The empty nursery in his cabin, the doctor's somber words years ago, the way his wife's hand had slipped from his after one loss too many. Saving her wasn't just duty. It was reclaiming the protector he'd buried under layers of routine. Clara glanced up from the monitors, her voice a soft interruption. Her temps stabilizing. 101, 2. The antibiotics are kicking in. But even as she spoke, the smaller cub let out a sharp, keening cry, its body convulsing in tiny spasms. Clara's face paled, hands flying to the oxygen mask. "Dehydration's hitting hard. We need to tube feed it now, or—" She trailed off, the implication hanging heavy. Elias nodded, scooping the cub gently, its fur damp against his calloused palms. The tigress's rumble deepened, protective, but she didn't rise too weak, her energy funneled into the slow mending of her wounds. The procedure unfolded in hushed intensity. Clara mixed the formula, her hands trembling as she inserted the tube, the cub's throat working feebly around it. Elias held it steady, feeling the rapid flutter of its heart, like a bird trapped in his grasp. The barn's air grew thick, the drip of the IV a metronome to their efforts. Outside, the voices swelled. Hargrove's insistence on calling the state wildlife agency, Riley's gruff warnings of escaped exotics breeding chaos. Voss's response was clipped, a barrier of authority, but Elias caught the hitch in her breath when a gust carried the cub's cry to the crowd. She turned away, staring at the empty highway, where dust devils swirled like ghosts of decisions not yet made. Hale burst back in then, arms laden with vials and a portable ultrasound, his face etched with the strain of the drive. "Council's mobilizing. Voss bought us an hour tops, but look at this." He scanned the tigress's abdomen, the screen flickering to life with grainy images, fluid pockets lingering. A shadow suggesting retained tissue from the birth. "Infection's deeper than we thought. Field surgery won't cut it. She needs the full OR at the clinic." His eyes met Elias's, the weight of the choice unspoken. Moving her now risked shock, collapse on the road. But staying meant facing the council's verdict, a swift end to mercy. The Tigress sensed the shift, her body tensing under the probe, a low chuff escaping as if protesting the intrusion, her eyes, half-lidded, fixed on Elias with an intensity that stripped away the room's clamor. In that gaze, he saw his own reflection, a man who'd patrolled fences to keep the wild at bay, yet now breached them all. Redemption wasn't grand gestures, it was this, the tremble in his fingers as he stroked her ear, the quiet vow to carry her through. "Prep the transport," Elias said finally, voice steady despite the knot in his throat. Clara bundled the cubs, their warmth a small anchor, while Hale loaded the enclosure onto a reinforced gurney. The door swung wide, admitting the afternoon's bite, and the crowd parted like a wary sea. Hargrove's glare burned, her words a hiss. "You're dooming us all, Thorne." Riley spat tobacco juice into the dirt, muttering about nature's balance tipped wrong. Mira stepped forward, her voice cutting through. "This isn't doom. It's what makes us human." Voss met Elias's eyes, a flicker of reluctant respect passing between them, the sheriff who'd enforced lines, now questioning her own. They wheeled the Tigress out, her form a pale spectre under the tarps. Breaths sinking with the creak of wheels on gravel. The highway stretched ahead, empty and unforgiving, engines idling in the distance like distant judgments. As the convoy pulled away, dust rising in their wake, the Tigress's head turned toward Elias in the trailing truck, her gaze a bridge across the miles. The cubs mewled softly, the smaller one's spasms easing into sleep. But the tension coiled tighter, medical crisis looming, the council's shadow lengthening. In the silence between heartbeats, Elias gripped the wheel, the cold morning's compassion now a fire tested by the road's relentless pull. The clinic's lights pierced the gathering dusk as they arrived, but inside the true storm brewed, not thunder, but the quiet unraveling of hope. Hale rushed ahead, barking orders to his team while Elias stayed with her, the enclosure's bars cold under his palms. Her breaths hitched sharper now, eyes glazing as the infection clawed deeper. "Fight it," he murmured, the words a prayer against the encroaching night. Outside, the world waited to judge, but in that enclosed space, only instinct remained. Raw, unyielding, binding man and beast in the hush before the fall. The clinic's sterile glow spilled into the twilight, a harsh counterpoint to the fading day's amber hues. Elias wheeled the enclosure through the back doors, the Tigress's form shifting uneasily within, her breaths now ragged gasps that echoed off the tiled walls. Hale's team, 2 nurses in scrubs, faces masked and taut, swarmed like shadows, unhooking straps and sliding the gurney into the OR bay. The air hummed with the whir of machines, sharp with the tang of disinfectants, but beneath it lingered the musky trace of her fur, a wild reminder in this cage of chrome and glass. "Get her under," Hale commanded, his voice steady but laced with the edge of exhaustion. The anesthesiologist nodded, gas hissing softly as the mask settled over her muzzle. Her golden eyes fluttered, locking onto Elias one last time, a plea, or perhaps forgiveness, before drifting shut. The cubs, bundled in a heated incubator nearby, mewled faintly, their tiny chests heaving in unison, the smaller one's blue eyes wide with instinctive fear. Clara transferred them to a side table, her hands gentle as she checked their vitals, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. Elias stood frozen at the threshold, the weight of the day pressing like an unseen hand on his shoulder. The highway's distant rumble filtered through the vents, a reminder of the world beyond. Willow Creek, stirring with whispers. The council's van, likely en route with edicts and forms. Voss had trailed them in her cruiser, now parked outside, her silhouette visible through the frosted window, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the horizon as if willing the stars to align with law over heart. Inside, the surgery unfolded in measured chaos. Hail incised along her abdomen, the scalpel's glint catching the overhead lights, revealing inflamed tissue swollen with infection. "Clamp here! It's worse than the scan showed. Retained placenta, abscess forming." His words were clipped, a litany against the rising tide. Blood-welled, dark and viscous, but no flood of gore, just the quiet seep, mopped away with gauze that whispered against skin. The tigress's flanks quivered under the drapes, her body fighting even in oblivion, muscles rippling like waves on a shadowed sea. Elias donned gloves at Hale's insistence, assisting with retractors, his arms burning from the strain. Up close, her presence overwhelmed, the heat radiating from her core, the faint scars crisscrossing her hide like maps of captivity. Barbed wire fences, perhaps, or the bite of chains from some forgotten breeder's pen. He thought of his own scars, invisible ones. The divorce papers yellowing in a drawer, the nursery dust-gathered and silent. Years ago, he'd promised his wife a family, but nature had other plans, losses that left him hollow, patrolling the wild as if to guard against further betrayal. Now, holding this mother's life in his steadying hands, the parallel struck like cold wind. Survival's cruel lottery, where instinct clashed with fragility. The monitors spiked, arrhythmia fluttering across the screen, her heart stuttering like an engine on empty. Hale's brow furrowed, sweat beading despite the chill. "Epe now, 0.5 milligram." The syringe plunged, her body arching subtly, a low, unconscious rumble vibrating the table. Elias's breath hitched, his free hand instinctively reaching to stroke her ear, the fur soft and warm. "Come on," he murmured, the words lost in the beeps and suctions. In that touch something shifted, a memory surfacing unbidden, a locket his wife had worn, engraved with a tiger's silhouette, a gift from their honeymoon in the tropics. She'd called it their talisman for strength, before grief eroded it all. Outside, the council arrived in a swirl of headlights and gravel crunch. Voss met them at the entrance, her voice muffled through the door. "She's stable for now, but the rangers call. Legally it's grey. Exotic animal ordinance." Mrs. Hargrove's retort sliced sharp. "Grey? It's black and white. That beast slaughtered my calf. Euthanize it or we'll sue the reserve dry." Riley's gravelly mutter followed, laced with old resentments. Thorne's always been a bleeding heart. Lost his own kid, now playing saviour to strays. The words seeped in, twisting like frostbite, but Elias didn't flinch. Instead, he focused on the tigress's rising pulse, the steady beep reclaiming rhythm. Clara worked on the cubs in tandem, tube-feeding the weaker one with formula warmed to body heat. Its spasms eased, paws needing air as milk took hold. A tiny triumph amid the storm. The mother stirred faintly under the sutures, her head turning toward the sound, nostrils flaring at the scent of her young. No roar, just a soft chuff, recognition, raw and wordless. Elias watched, a lump forming in his throat, the room's silence amplifying every nuance, the drip of saline, the hum of lamps, the distant tick of a clock marking time's indifferent march. Hale closed the incision with precise stitches, his exhale ragged as he stepped back. "She's through the worst, for now, but recovery's touch and go. Needs isolation, monitoring round the clock." He peeled off his gloves, eyes meeting Elias's in shared fatigue. "You saved her today, Thorne, not just from the cold, but from us, from what we could have become if we'd walked away." The OR doors swung open then, admitting Voss, her face a mask of conflicted resolve. The crowd lingered beyond, their shadows flickering like judgments on the wall. "Council's giving 24 hours, she said quietly, voice stripped of its usual edge. "Paperwork's flying, but I told them about the cubs. Bought you time." Her gaze drifted to the Tigress, softening imperceptibly, the sheriff glimpsing her own buried compassion, perhaps recalling her father's hands nursing that fawn under kitchen lights. Elias nodded, stripping his gloves, the latex snapping like a breaking tension. He approached the enclosure, where the tigress lay bandaged and serene, her eyes cracking open in the dimming lights. One cub nuzzled her side, the other curling close, their warmth a fragile circle. Her gaze found his again, steady and profound, as if sensing the echo in his locket's memory. The tiger that had symbolized lost hopes, now reborn in fur and breath. Night pressed against the windows, the highway empty save for cooling engines in the lot. Dust settled on the sills, the world outside holding its breath. But inside, in the hush of recovery, Elias felt the unbelievable stir, not just survival, but a connection deepening, instinct whispering truths yet to unfold. The tigress's chest rose evenly now, a quiet promise against the encroaching dark, binding their fates in silent loyalty. The clinic's recovery ward settled into an uneasy vigil as midnight crept in. The fluorescent lights dimmed to a soft amber glow that mimicked moonlight filtering through barred windows. Elias sat on a metal stool beside the tigress's enclosure, his elbows resting on knees worn from the day's grind, eyes tracing the slow rise and fall of her bandaged flanks. Her white fur, now cleaned and fluffed under the warming blanket, caught the light like fresh snow. But shadows lingered in the hollows of her eyes, remnants of the fight that had nearly claimed her. The cubs slept curled against her, their breaths a faint chorus, the smaller one's paw twitching in dreams of milk and safety. No mules pierced the quiet, only the steady beep of the heart monitor and the distant hum of the highway, where semis rumbled like indifferent guardians of the night. Hale had retreated to his office, paperwork a bulwark against exhaustion, but Clara lingered, adjusting the IV line with hands that still trembled from the OR's intensity. She was in her 30s, a transplant from the city who'd traded skyscrapers for this rural edge, drawn by a love for the unseen wild. "She's responding," she whispered, more to the air than Elias, her voice threading the silence like a needle, temp holding at 101, but that arrhythmia. It could flare. Elias nodded, his gaze unbroken, the tigress's presence an anchor in the sterile room. Up close, her scent, musk and medicine, filled his senses, evoking the wild's unyielding pull, the same one that had drawn him to the reserve after his losses, seeking solace in patrols rather than people. Outside, the parking lot held a fragile peace, Voss's cruiser idling with its lights off, a silent watch against the council's looming deadline. The sheriff had stayed, her silhouette etched against the dashboard glow, radio silent for the first time in hours. Willow Creek's night wrapped the building in frost-kissed quiet, the air crisp with the promise of more cold, dust from the day's traffic settling on windshields like forgotten regrets. Mira had slipped away earlier, her photos already whispering through town via a quick upload. Images of compassion amid crisis, stirring a few supportive murmurs amid the fear, but the crowd had dispersed uneasily, Hargrove's parting glare a vow of persistence, Riley's truck peeling out with gravel spitting defiance. Elias shifted, his boot scraping the tile, and the tigress stirred. Her head lifted fractionally, golden eyes opening to slits that pierced the dimness, fixing on him with that profound, wordless depth. No growl, just a soft exhalation, warm and ragged, carrying the faint rattle of lingering congestion. He reached through the bars, palm open, and she didn't recoil, her muzzle brushing his fingers in a gesture raw with instinct, whiskers tickling like fragile trust. In that touch, the unbelievable deepened. Not just survival, but recognition. Her eyes held his, reflecting the locket's tiger from his past, the symbol his wife had worn until grief shattered it. He'd kept it hidden, a talisman of what he'd failed to protect. But now it burned against his chest, unearthed by the day's mercy. A sharp beep shattered the hush, the monitor spiking, her heart racing into frenzy. Elias bolted upright, hand steadying her flank as her body convulsed, muscles rippling under the bandages. "Clara!" His call was low, urgent, pulling her from the corner where she dozed, the tigress's breaths hitched into gasps. Her eyes wide with panic, paws scrabbling weakly at the enclosure floor. The cubs startled, mewling in chorus, the smaller one tumbling away in confusion, its tiny form exposed and trembling. Clara rushed over, defibrillator pads in hand, her face paling under the lights. Fib, get the crash cart!" The room erupted into controlled chaos, wires snaking, paddles charging with a high whine that cut the night like a blade. Elias held her head, murmuring nonsense. "Easy, girl, I've got you." His voice cracking as her body arched, the white fur stark against the convulsions. Pain etched her features, not in blood, but in the desperate flare of nostrils, the glaze of eyes pleading against the void. He felt it viscerally, the echo of his own silent breakdowns after the miscarriages. The nights he'd driven empty highways, engines roar, drowning grief, wondering if he'd ever bridge the chasm of loss. Hale burst in, alerted by the alarm, his scrubs rumpled, eyes sharpening to the task. "Clear!" The shock jolted her, body jerking like a puppet cut loose, the monitor flatlining into silence that pressed heavier than any roar. Elias's breath caught, hand frozen on her ear, the world narrowing to that lifeless beep. Seconds stretched, eternal, the cub's cries a distant wail. Then a blip, faint and stuttering, building to rhythm. Hale exhaled, wiping his brow. "Back, but she's crashing hard, sepsis spreading. We need to up the antibiotics. Transfuse if we can source plasma." Voss appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, her hand on her holster out of habit, face drawn in the harsh light. "What the hell happened?" Her words were clipped, but her eyes betrayed the fracture. The lawman confronting the fragility she'd enforced away. Elias met her gaze over the tigress's form, the unbelievable truth surfacing. This wasn't just an animal, it was a mirror to his buried failures. The child he'd never held, now embodied in her cub's vulnerability. "She's fighting," he said simply, voice thick. "Like we all are." Clara bundled the cubs back to their mother, the tigress's rumble softening to a protective purr as they nestled close, her strength ebbing but unyielding. Hale adjusted the drip, the room settling into watchful quiet once more, machines humming like weary sentinels. Outside, the first hints of dawn grayed the horizon, the highway stirring with early traffic, engines cooling in the lot, dust motes swirling in the chill. The council's 24 hours ticked down, but in this suspended breath, redemption bloomed. Elias's hand lingered on her fur, the locket warm against his skin, instinct forging a bond that defied fences and fears. The tigress's eyes met his again, steadying, a silent vow exchanged in the hush. Survival hung by threads of compassion, of choice. But in the cold morning's approach, hope flickered raw and real, pulling them toward an unimaginable dawn. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of this white tiger reach more people who still believe in kindness. Dawn broke over Willow Creek like a hesitant promise, pale light filtering through the clinic's blinds, casting striped shadows across the recovery ward. Elias hadn't slept, his vigil unbroken, the stool beneath him a throne of weariness. The tigress lay still under the enclosure's bars, her white coat rising and falling in a rhythm that had steadied through the night, shallow but persistent, each breath a quiet defiance against the machine's insistent beeps. The cubs, now stronger, kneaded her flanks with tiny paws, their eyes fully open, golden flecks mirroring their mothers. Clara had slipped away at first light, leaving coffee steaming on a side table, but Elias ignored it. His focus locked on the subtle shifts in her form, the twitch of an ear, the faint curl of a lip. The highway stirred outside, engines rumbling to life as ranchers headed to fields, their headlights cutting brief swaths through the frost. Dust from overnight winds swirled in eddies against the windows, carrying the scent of pine and earth into the room. Voss's cruiser was gone, replaced by the council's unmarked van, its occupants likely inside now, voices murmuring in the lobby like a gathering storm. Elias could hear the low cadence, Hargrove's insistent pitch, Riley's gravelly interruptions. But he tuned it out, his hand resting near the bars, inches from her muzzle. The Tigress's eyes opened slowly, golden and clear, holding his without the glaze of fever. No rumble, just that steady gaze, instinct bridging the silence between them. Hale entered quietly, charts in hand, his face lined with the night's toll. He checked the monitors, nodding faintly. Infections retreating, white count dropping. She's turning the corner. His words hung, a fragile optimism. But Elias sensed the undercurrent. The council's deadline loomed at noon. Paperwork a noose tightening around Mercy. Hale glanced at the door, where shadows shifted. They're pushing for relocation to a facility upstate. Quarantine assessment, if she's deemed a threat. He trailed off, the implication heavy as the air before rain. Elias didn't respond, his fingers brushing the locket under his shirt, the tiger's engraving warm against his skin. The unbelievable had begun to unfold in the night's quiet hours, not with drama, but revelation. As her convulsions eased, the tigress had nuzzled his hand with deliberate pressure, her breath warm and knowing, as if scenting something familiar beyond the antiseptic. He'd pulled the locket free then, holding it near her muzzle, a whim born of exhaustion. Her nostrils flared, eyes widening fractionally, a soft chuff escaping that vibrated through the bars. It wasn't coincidence. Years ago, before the reserve, Elias had volunteered at a distant sanctuary, handling orphaned cubs from raided breeders. One, a white tigress kit, had worn a similar token around her neck, a breeder's tag shaped like a locket etched with stripes. He'd petted her for hours, whispering promises of freedom before she was relocated. Life's cruel turns had scattered them, him to Montana's fences, her to whatever hell had driven her here, scarred and pregnant. The connection hit him like cold wind through cracks. She recognized him, or at least the echo of kindness in his scent, the locket's metal. No supernatural bond, just instinct's long memory, the wild remembering a gentle hand amid captivity's chains. It reframed everything, his patrols no longer isolation, but a circle closing. The losses that had hollowed him, the unborn child, the wife's departure, paled against this silent loyalty, a mother's survival mirroring his own buried hopes. The door creaked open, Voss stepping in with two council suits, their faces stern under fluorescent pallor. Hargrove followed, shawl clutched like armor, Riley at her elbow, pipe clenched unlit. "Time's up, Thorne," one suit said, voice flat as the forms in his briefcase. "She's stable enough for transport. State facility will handle evaluation, likely euthanasia if she's exotic and untraceable." Hargrove nodded sharply. "My calf's blood is on her paws. No more risks." Elias rose slowly, positioning himself between them and the enclosure, his stance unyielding. The tigress sensed the tension, her head lifting, a low rumble building. Not threat, but warning, her eyes flicking from him to the intruders. The cubs stirred, huddling closer, their mules faint threads in the thickening air. Voss hesitated, her hand twitching toward her radio, the sheriff's resolve cracking under the weight of the night's vigil. "Wait," she said, voice low. "Look at her. She's not rabid or rogue. She came to us, and those cubs. They're innocents." Hale interjected, charts extended. "Medically, she's no threat now. Trace her origins, rehab her here. The reserve can manage. I've got protocols." Mira slipped in behind them, uninvited. her phone screen glowing with shared photos, the rescue's raw moments, comments flooding from viewers far beyond Willow Creek, stories of compassion echoing back, urging mercy. The room held its breath, silence judging the standoff. Hargrove's glare softened imperceptibly, her own losses, a husband to the wild's whims, surfacing in the Tigress's pleading eyes. Riley shifted, pipe tapping his thigh, muttering, "Maybe. Not worth the paperwork." The suits conferred in whispers, the unbelievable tipping the scale, not force, but the quiet power of witnessed truth, the locket's secret now a shared whisper as Elias revealed it, Hale corroborating the sanctuary link. By noon, the verdict shifted, probationary rehab at the reserve under strict monitoring. No euthanasia, just time for healing. As they prepared the transport back, the Tigress rose unsteadily, cubs clinging to her sides, her gaze lingering on Elias with profound acknowledgement. The highway awaited, empty and vast, dust settling in the midday sun. Weeks blurred into spring's thaw, the reserve's meadows greening under tentative warmth. Elias patrolled less alone now, the Tigress in a secure paddock, her strength returning in measured steps. The cubs played, tumbling in sun-dappled grass, their white forms symbols of resilience. One evening, as frost yielded to wildflowers, she approached the fence where he stood, muzzle pressing through the wire. He offered his hand, the locket glinting, and she chuffed softly, nuzzling it, instinct's redemption. A bond forged in cold mornings and silent nights. The town transformed subtly. Hargrove donated feed, Voss advocated for expansions, Mira's story spreading like wind through pines. Elias felt whole, the nursery's dust swept away, his heart's fences breached by compassion's quiet justice. In the end, as summer crested, the Tigress and her cubs were released to a vast sanctuary far east, their forms vanishing into the horizon, a white silhouette against golden fields, walking free with tails high. Elias watched from afar, the locket now hers again, looped around her neck. Survival's weight lifted, leaving hope's light breath, a reminder that kindness echoes beyond the wild's edge. The world still needed it, fierce, misunderstood, but unbreakable. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of He Saved a White Tigress and Her Cubs. But what happened later was unbelievable. See you in the next one.